4. The Russo-German War. The discrepancy between communist theory and individualist practice in Russia was one cause of the next disaster which befell Europe. Between Russia and Germany there should have been close partnership based on the interchange of machinery and corn, but the theory of communism stood in the way, and in a strange manner. Russian industrial organisation had proved impossible without American capital, and little by little this influence had transformed the communistic system, from the Baltic to the Himalayas and the Bering Straits, pasture, timberlands, machine-tilled cornland, oil fields, and a spreading rash of industrial towns were increasingly dependent on American finance and organisation. Yet not America, but the far less individualistic Germany had become, in the Russian mind, the symbol of capitalism. Self-righteous hate of Germany compensated Russia for her own betrayal of the communistic ideal. This perverse antagonism was encouraged by the Americans, who, strong in their own individualism and prosperity, and by now contemptuously tolerant of Russian doctrines, were concerned only to keep Russian finance to themselves. In truth, of course, it was America that had helped Russia's self-betrayal, and it was the spirit of America that was most alien to the Russian spirit. But American wealth was by now indispensable to Russia, so the hate due to America had to be borne vicariously by Germany. The Germans, for their part, were aggrieved that the Americans had ousted them from a most profitable field of enterprise, and in particular from the exploitation of Russian Asiatic oil. The economic life of the human race had for some time been based on coal, but latterly oil had been found a far more convenient source of power. And as the oil store of the planet was much smaller than its coal store, and the expenditure of oil had, of course, been wholly uncontrolled and wasteful, a shortage was already being felt. Thus, the national ownership of the remaining oil fields became a main factor in politics and a fertile source of wars. America, having used up most of her own supplies, was now anxious to compete with the still prolific sources under Chinese control by forestalling Germany in Russia. No wonder the Germans were aggrieved, but the fault was their own. In the days when Russian communism had been seeking to convert the world, Germany had taken over England's leadership of individualistic Europe. While greedy for trade with Russia, she had been at the same time frightened of contamination by Russian social doctrine, the more so because communism had, at first, made some headway among the German workers. Later, even when sane industrial reorganisation in Germany had deprived communism of its appeal to the workers and thus had rendered it impotent, the habit of anti-communist vituperation persisted. Thus the peace of Europe was in constant danger from the bickerings of two peoples who differed rather in ideals than in practice. For the one, in theory communistic, had been forced to delegate many of the community's rights to enterprising individuals, while the other, in theory organised on a basis of private business, was becoming ever more socialised. Neither party desired war. Neither was interested in military glory, for militarism as an end was no longer reputable. Neither was professedly nationalistic, for nationalism, though still potent, was no longer vaunted. Each claimed to stand for internationalism and peace, but accused the other of narrow patriotism. Thus Europe, though more pacific than ever before, was doomed to war. Like most wars, the Anglo-French War had increased the desire for peace, yet made peace less secure. Distrust, not merely the old distrust of nation for nation, but a devastating distrust of human nature, gripped men like the dread of insanity. Individuals who thought of themselves as wholehearted Europeans feared that at any moment they might succumb to some ridiculous epidemic of patriotism and participate in the further crippling of Europe. This dread was one cause of the formation of a European confederacy, in which all the nations of Europe, save Russia, surrendered their sovereignty to a common authority and actually pooled their armaments. Ostensibly the motive of this act was peace, but America interpreted it as directed against herself, and withdrew from the League of Nations. China, the natural enemy of America, remained within the League, hoping to use it against her rival. From without, indeed, the Confederacy at first appeared as a close-knit whole, but from within it was known to be insecure, and in every serious crisis it broke. There is no need to follow the many minor wars of this period, though their cumulative effect was serious, both economically and psychologically. Europe did at last, however, become something like a single nation in sentiment, though this unity was brought about less by a common loyalty than by a common fear of America. Final consolidation was the fruit of the Russo-German War, the cause of which was partly economic and partly sentimental. All the peoples of Europe had long watched with horror the financial conquest of Russia by the United States, and they dreaded that they also must presently succumb to the same tyrant. To attack Russia, it was thought, would be to wound America in her only vulnerable spot. But the actual occasion of the war was sentimental. Half a century after the Anglo-French War, a second-rate German author published a typically German book of the baser sort. For as each nation had its characteristic virtues, so also each was prone to characteristic follies. This book was one of those brilliant but extravagant works in which the whole diversity of existence is interpreted under a single formula, with extreme detail and plausibility, yet with amazing naivety. Highly astute within its own artificial universe, it was nonetheless, in wider regard, quite uncritical. In 2 large volumes, the author claimed that the cosmos was a dualism in which a heroic and obviously Nordic spirit ruled by divine right over an unself-disciplined, yet servile, and obviously Slavonic spirit. The whole of history and of evolution was interpreted on this principle, and of the contemporary world it was said that the Slavonic element was poisoning Europe. One phrase in particular caused fury in Moscow: the anthropoid face of the Russian sub-man. Moscow demanded apology and suppression of the book. Berlin regretted the insult, but with its tongue in its cheek, and insisted on the freedom of the press. Followed a crescendo of radio hate and war. The details of this war do not matter to one intent upon the history of mind in the solar system, but its result was important. Moscow, Leningrad and Berlin were shattered from the air. The whole west of Russia was flooded with the latest and deadliest poison gas, so that not only was all animal and vegetable life destroyed, but also the soil between the Black Sea and the Baltic was rendered infertile and uninhabitable for many years. Within a week the war was over, for the reason that the combatants were separated by an immense territory in which life could not exist, but the effects of the war were lasting. The Germans had set going a process which they could not stop. Whiffs of the poison continued to be blown by fickle winds into every country of Europe and Western Asia. It was springtime, but save in the Atlantic coastlands, the spring flowers shriveled in the bud, and every young leaf had a withered rim. Humanity also suffered, though save in the regions near the seat of war, it was generally only the children and the old people who suffered greatly. The poison spread across the continent in huge blown tresses broad as principalities, swinging with each change of wind, and wherever it strayed, young eyes, throats and lungs were blighted like the leaves. America, after much debate, had at last decided to defend her interests in Russia by a punitive expedition against Europe. China began to mobilize her forces, but long before America was ready to strike, news of the widespread poisoning changed her policy. Instead of punishment, help was given. This was a fine gesture of goodwill, but also, as was observed in Europe, instead of being costly, it was profitable, for inevitably it brought more of Europe under American financial control. The upshot of the Russo-German War, then, was that Europe was unified in sentiment by hatred of America, and that European mentality definitely deteriorated. This was due in part to the emotional influence of the war itself, partly to the socially damaging effect of the poison. A proportion of the rising generation had been rendered sickly for life. During the 30 years which intervened before the Euro-American War, Europe was burdened with an exceptional weight of invalids. First-class intelligence was, on the whole, rarer than before, and was more strictly concentrated on the practical work of reconstruction. Even more disastrous for the human race was the fact that the recent Russian cultural enterprise of harmonizing Western intellectualism and Eastern mysticism was now wrecked. 4.